Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dimitri Kalyegan. I want to first and foremost say that Christ is risen. I hope everybody enjoyed their Pascha. As we are recording this, Dimitri has celebrated Pascha. I have not yet, due to time differentiation. So by the time you have listened to this, I will have celebrated the feast of the resurrection of our Lord. We have just witnessed the holy fire descend onto the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem at 2:14 p.m. local time. It was early in the morning for me, so it's beautiful to see that. Apparently it took a little over 5 minutes for the fire to descend this year, which is quite quick, so we're very pleased with that glorious miracle, and we're happy to celebrate the feast of the resurrection of Christ in the midst of the unfolding Third World War. So Dimitri, how are you doing? Christos Voskressi.
Воистину воскресе, Conrad, and all the listeners as well. Christ is risen. It's a wonderful weekend. It's a wonderful week, and the feast day, the greatest feast day of our church calendar. It's good to be here to discuss the news, of course, for all our listeners. Probably eager to have a quick update before you go into your bright week, or maybe even amidst your bright week, to sort of understand what's happening in world affairs. Truth be told, actually a lot has taken place, given the fact that a lot of Christians are actually taking it quite easy around the world. But as we know, the world does not run according to the Christian timeline. People really ignore the Christian fast and continue with their worldly, devious affairs, sometimes much to our sort of, confusion, because, this sort of disrespect of the church's traditions seems to really affect, I guess, how we react, much to our, of course, confusion. But, to begin, in Jerusalem, the holy fire has successfully descended. God has actually provided us this great miracle on the great feast day of Easter on Great Saturday at around 2 p.m., which is a little bit later than usual. The holy fire descended, and the Patriarch of Jerusalem has left the tomb, lit up with his 33 candles, and of course lit up the entire Holy Sepulchre with light. And as we saw, the people were happy to greet it. And despite all the various roadblocks, which a few hours before the actual Holy Saturday service, we saw some blockades were being placed by Israeli police officers and different security guards, allegedly for the safety of the Christian people, right? This is what the official sources were stating. But nevertheless, they tried to somewhat interrupt the particular service. The service still was packed. I think, this wasn't like the COVID restrictions, which we saw in 2020 or 2021. The Holy Sepulchre was full of Palestinians, Christians of various denominations, even pilgrims from Russia. You could hear Christos Voskresje being shouted. You can hear Church Slavonic, Arabic, different languages, of course, Greek. So it was quite a celebration, I think, in terms of like the Christian Catholicity, universality. And again, this is what we love to see from the Holy Sepulchre and Jerusalem as the center of the world. So the great feast day went ahead successfully, I would say. But there were some interesting developments, Conrad. I noticed a member of the Greek consulate's guard was actually seized and taken aback inside the actual church itself prior to the holy fire coming down. There was a bit of a scuffle, and I'm not sure who exactly was at fault here, but again, it could be just a sort of bag of them boys, trying to disrupt a particular service, trying to take somebody away, causing a menace inside of the Holy Greek Church. So I'm just wondering if you have any information about that story, because if this was just if the particular Greek consul guard had some sort of dispute, or was this the Israeli police just causing a menace, perhaps being overly secure and just trying to disrupt and demoralize some of the Christians who gathered there for the holy fire?
Yeah, I don't know the exact details. It's all kind of just coming out, but we have some reports from outlets that talk about how it was Israeli occupation authorities. They arrested him and dragged him out, and some even say that he was beaten. And I've not seen any reports from the IDF claiming he supposedly did anything wrong. So it looks like another instance of the Zionist authorities trying to restrict the amount of people that can make it. They try to kind of send a message that it's not really something that they want people coming to Jerusalem to celebrate. The roadblocks were able to restrict people from walking from certain parts of the city and whatnot. Of course, it's packed. I think they always end up violating the occupancy restrictions that they try to put on them, even with fire code and all this other stuff. But obviously it's not up to fire code, as fire is about to be spread across the entire building and everything. So it was beautiful to see, but it's quite interesting to witness this miracle in the Holy Land in the midst of everything going on right now, because we hear that the Rafah operation will occur within a week if some ceasefire agreement or hostage exchange is not met with Hamas, between Israel and Hamas and the other resistance groups in Gaza, Palestinian Islamic Jihad and whatnot. But we have also witnessed other members of the axis of resistance, like the Houthis, saying that they're now targeting all ships in the Red Sea regardless. They have succeeded in completely blockading the Eilat, southern Israel port. Only 2 ships have successfully entered that port, I believe, since 2024 has started. I don't know if that's exactly accurate, but they have been very successful in stopping Eilat, Israel's southern port, from being used economically at all. And at the same time, we hear that Turkey has sanctioned Israel. Basically, they're no longer importing or doing trade with Israeli goods, and in response, the Israelis sanctioned Turkey. So, big trade relationship that existed in the past. We, of course, know that Israel and Azerbaijan are still quite close, but this relationship between Israel and Turkey was quite a strong and close trade regional relationship, and that has been totally disrupted. We've seen Erdogan fully moving into supporting the axis of resistance. We've discussed how basically Turkey is to Hamas what Iran is to Hezbollah, Houthis, the other members of the axis of resistance. Not exactly, because Turkey is more secular and they have less of the militant Islamic thing going on, but they are Sunni. Hamas is Sunni, unlike the rest of the axis of resistance, who are Shia. So that connection really is there. But as far as Netanyahu and his situation goes with the invasion of Rafah, we hear that Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, those are the hardliners in the cabinet that are against Netanyahu, using the Rafah invasion as a bartering chip. They want to just go in regardless. They want full Israeli rule over Gaza, returning of the settlements and all of that. We've heard that the plan right now is for some kind of self-rule from the Arabs in Gaza, while Israeli security forces are still able to enforce the situation on the ground there. So kind of like a West Bank situation, maybe without the settlers. They're trying to figure that out. The international community is really trying to move forward with a 2-state solution, which the Israelis are very much against. And it seems that the protests against Netanyahu have dramatically increased as well. We're seeing some of the biggest ones since the very beginning of all of this started. And on the one hand, he is more unpopular than ever, but on the other hand, he kind of is the only person that can keep all of this together to satisfy the hardliners while not being such a hardliner that the other people form a total coalition against you and just completely arrest you and overthrow you. Like, I mean, who knows what would happen if Ben-Gvir or Smotrich or one of these people were actually, the prime minister or something like that. But Gallant and Benny Gantz are the more moderates, and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are having a lot of problems with them as well, because they want to use this to not just to do everything they want in Gaza and the West Bank, but also to goad Iran into the war with America that will then, in theory, have America destroy their biggest enemy and other enemies in the region on their behalf. So we're watching all of that very closely. I'm wondering, Dimitri, your thoughts on the Gaza axis of resistance situation. We also see Turkey doing other things in the region, but the conflict is still centered around Israel-Palestine.
Yeah, it very much is. And I think on one hand, we see a real sort of calming down towards this period, from Iran, actually, like a very quiet sort of rhetoric coming from Iran, really not looking to reignite any sort of scuffle or skirmish again with Israel, like we saw in weeks prior, which is, I think, very curious. And that's very different from the reaction of the Houthis, who are standing strong, much in their, as well as in their PR, as well as their actual palpable, pragmatic actions in the Red Sea. So I think that's probably a good stance, because again, the genocide has not been called off officially, and until the hostage exchange takes place, until the Israelis actually withdraw from Gaza, from the Strip itself, I think nothing's really off the table for the Netanyahu government, which is, as we can see, is probably primed on at least taking real estate away from the Palestinians, away from the people of Gaza, and who knows what they're planning to do in the West Bank as well after they're done with this particular strip, and perhaps even expanding into South Lebanon. That's always a potential. But the good news, I suppose, is that during the Passion Week prior to Easter, it has been relatively quiet in terms of bombardment. It has perhaps lessened by about 50%. And this may be due to the fact that the Rafah negotiations, as you mentioned them, have in fact intensified both internally. There's protests in Israel every single day, which the mainstream media simply does not cover. Anti-Netanyahu protests, sort of stop the war, hippie-type protests. And of course, we know the Jews in Israel around Tel Aviv. Like, Tel Aviv is 25% LGBTQ alphabet community. So those type of people, regardless of them being plants and sort of created by the globalist Talmudic regime, they're still, and sometimes they act even against their own masters. So the golem really wakes up and it just starts acting like a hippie during the Vietnam War protests, and sort of maybe even going against the interests of its own government. So that's a little bit of a nuisance, I think, for the Israeli Zionist state, because these people are protesting for peace, and peace with whom? With the Hamas in Palestine, who's really upset with Israel. Again, it doesn't seem like a very pro-Israeli position at this point, at least for the Zionist side. So they're a little bit frustrated by the protests, but at the same time, external pressure from the Biden government. Biden is really trying to come out as this philo-Semitic sort of peacekeeper who can actually prevent the Rafah operation from taking place, because this has been looming over us for like quite a few weeks now, and everybody knows what will take place. With those 2 million people affected, when Israeli tanks start driving in, it'll be different than simply bombardment from the air from Israeli drones and planes on singular buildings, or even the occupation of a hospital somewhere in Khan Yunis. This will be probably on a different stage, entirely. And of course, we see Egypt as well providing really strong external, like foreign relations type pressure on Israel to sort of try and prevent them from pushing this particular agenda in Rafah. Now, this is reflected even in figures such as Alex Jones in the alternative media space, bringing forward like a very powerful speech recently where he just calls Netanyahu, all kinds of words and slurs, and he almost goes into like a completely anti-Semitic mode, saying that Netanyahu really wants to cause the Rafah operation to take place so that all the unfortunately refugees and forced emigres from Palestine actually go to the United States, and he's like, we don't want these refugees who will be displaced from their homeland. So Alex Jones really taking a strong position. I think his view reflects the review of the general American an American view that, the Americans simply want to grill. The American boomer doesn't want any more of these sort of international burdens placed upon their shoulders. Not saying that the Palestinians are a burden, but again, a social security system does need to look after these people. And I think Egypt has a similar position, Conrad, where Egypt really doesn't have the capacity. Egypt isn't the richest country. It's struggling with imports, exports. COVID has heavily affected the Egyptian economy. And generally speaking, the world economy is in quite a major recession, I would say, since COVID, since the money printing. Inflation is over the border with a lot of these countries. And Egypt really doesn't have, I think, the long-term sustainable economic sort of growth and prosperity to sort of sustain 1 to 2 million refugees on its territory, regardless of the camps to which it builds and even the refugee camps itself. Can you imagine the oversight and the auditing which will take place from the international community? There's going to be like commissions looking into Egyptian abuse and refugee camps, things like that. We know Egyptians generally are nice people, but they do have like a high degree of criminality, I think, in most of their major cities. So can you even trust Egyptian staff members in some of these camps? It's all kinds of concerns which Egypt simply does not want at this point. And just in general, like Middle Eastern people, despite their, we spoke about their Sunni common religious affinity between, say, Jordanians and Palestinians, but they also have very strong tribal understand. Like these people understand tribal and ethnic differences. They're not as multicultural and cosmopolitan as perhaps even Europeans were brainwashed into thinking they were. Like these people know the difference between a Palestinian and an Egyptian simply by looking at them externally, as well as how the way they speak, the way their mannerisms are. You cannot simply assimilate Palestinians into Egyptian society or Palestinians into Jordanian society. This has become quite clear. And even Lebanese and Palestinian people, this is like oil and water. They don't really mix, despite for us Europeans perhaps and Western viewers, we may see them as literally the same people. Their skin tone, olive skin tone, same hair, same eyes, even the same language perhaps. But of course, for the local people, they can spot every single small minor difference. And so this is probably one of those major factors which prevents, again, these elites understand the cultural differences. They don't want to have these refugees and unfortunately displaced and even militarized people. The Palestinians have been heavily militarized in large part due to the Israeli invasion itself. They don't want this potential group of trained individuals on its own territory. So it's really between a rock and a hard place for the poor Palestinians, but hopefully the negotiations and maybe the internal pressure on Netanyahu will actually prevent this Rafah genocide from taking place, I think. And we can maybe even call it its own separate genocide, because what will take place there will be perhaps one of the most unspeakable events of the 21st century thus far, probably worse than the invasion of Iraq, I would say. So we have to just take that into consideration. There's a lot of positive developments generally, Conrad, this week, just simply because I've noticed the pressure on Netanyahu has been a lot stronger. And in fact, this is perhaps why he's held off for the past 2-3 weeks. And, I'm just hoping maybe an Easter miracle will take place. And maybe I'm being a little bit naive here, but perhaps this could be stopped and even slowed down. Not even to a halt, but perhaps it could be delayed to a point where a foreign entity like Lebanon, Hezbollah, Iran could intervene in time, perhaps to save the lives of these innocent people trapped here in southern Gaza.
We are all awaiting at bated breath. It seems that they're just dragging this thing out to get their political stuff in order. We all thought that this Rafah invasion was going to happen a long time ago. So it proves that there is pressure on Israel. But we do need to talk about the Christians in Gaza City still at St. Porphyrios Orthodox Church. They celebrated, the sacrament of Holy Unction earlier this week. They are now celebrating the Paschal Feast, the resurrection of Christ, the few hundred Christians remaining there. There are reports now of the Israelis making refugee camps farther and farther north near Khan Yunis. We talked about this last week. There are talks about eventually moving people farther north. Again, you mentioned all of the Egypt stuff. All of these different parties within Israel want to do different things with these Palestinian people. Some of them want to kill them all. Others want to send them to Egypt. Others want to, you know, oppress them under, the Israeli yoke, just in the Gaza Strip under their lock and key. That's considered the humanitarian option. So people have all sorts of machinations for the region. The U.S. had to move farther north to build their pier due to weather issues, apparently. That was a bit interesting. So U.S. operators and military contractors and Army Corps of Engineers are on the ground in Gaza doing all of this, which is just a ticking time bomb. Anything could happen to these people. Who knows if there's a false flag in the works? Who knows what the Israelis could have hooked up? Who knows if they could have fake Hamas do something to them? So really, really dangerous situation that U.S. servicemen are being put in. But as far as escalations go in the rest of the region, we have heard, I mean, the whole region basically is in conflict in some capacity, up to the Caucasus, down south to the mouth of the Red Sea at the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, and of course the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant itself. And we see now Turkey beginning its operations into Iraq. We saw their operations into Syria. They had established a corridor there to fight against PKK Kurdish terrorists, as they have designated. And that situation is escalating again, with Turkey hoping to establish a pretty large corridor on their border into Iraq with Turkish military control. This is from a Kurdish source. They say, in the security talks between Turkey and Iraq about the military operation, the creation of a security belt encompassing all areas where the PKK is active, including the Kandil Mountains, was discussed. The security belt would encompass the areas where Turkish military bases are currently located in the Kurdistan region. Ankara aims for the area to be 30 to 40 kilometers deep, similar to its approach in Syria, to sever physical connection between the PKK in Iraq and the Kurdish People's Defense Units in northern Syria. Turkey expects to conduct large-scale military operations with the support of Erbil and the involvement of Baghdad's intelligence services and the Hashid al-Shabi against the PKK. The relevant parties must also implement strict security measures in both Suleimani and Sinjar, which are regions in Kurdistan. The issue with the Kurds is that they are a US-backed proxy in a lot of ways, a far-left communist proxy. You'll even hear of, Pacific Northwest militant Antifa groups going over there and training and fighting with the PKK and, showing their support for them with their, gay flag waving and other activism. But the Turks are, I mean, again, they've gone into Syria, where Kurds are active militantly. Of course, they're mostly active as well in eastern Turkey, and they're also active in Iraq. We know that's all of the region of Kurdistan, as it were, and we know that the prophecies of St. Paisios talk about how at the end of the war between Russia and Turkey and kind of the fallout of the truly hot Third World War we're all in for in the future, a larger Armenian state will emerge, as well as an independent Kurdish state, obviously meaning that Turkey itself will be dramatically shrunk. And it seems that, those, chess moves that could result in that end are being moved into place right now. We know that Turkey eventually will begin to side more with the US. I could totally see Erdogan, when he goes, his successors, the Kemalists, ceding all of these ambitious pushes into Iraq and Syria against the Kurds. I could see, them refocusing perhaps on Greece and allowing the Kurds to perhaps remain more free, perhaps, putting down the PKK while raising up a, kind of psyop version of a Kurdish, independence party or something like that. Who knows how the Kemalists may go about handling that, but Turkey is very much involved in all of these regions, and I think they're able to interface with the Iraqi government more because of the situation in Palestine. They have grown closer together. Turkey is not viewed as this, Western friend as much. They're viewed as a staunch ally of Islam in Palestine against the Zionist entity, which is uniting the Muslim world right now. We are hearing reports that Saudi Arabia is cracking down on online anti-Israel speech, which is very unfortunate. People talk about how the House of Saud are Jews anyway, so they have obviously been one of the weakest links within the Islamic resistance to Israel, but they are still very much against Rafah invasion and the expulsion of Palestinians, and they support a two-state solution, which of course Israel cannot have. The only other pretty interesting development in the region, we talk about Syria, is that the Druze people, the large pagan, pre-Christian, pre-Muslim, animist minority, kind of satanic group of people in Syria, have now turned against Assad. In the past, I believe they had been generally tolerant and accepting of the Assad regime. They were not pro the Free Syrian Army or the quote-unquote moderate rebels that did terrorism against Assad's SAA. But they have now mobilized large groups of Druze in the regions of Syria where they populate, are calling for the end of Assad. They've come out against Assad. So it seems like the U.S. has activated their pagan, demonic forces in the Syrian region, these ancient people. So, Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts on what's going on in ancient Mesopotamia.
Yes, I think those developments regarding the Kurds, like this is a clear sign from Turkey and I think the Turkish Azerbaijan front that while the iron is still hot, you can actually mold the metal to your liking. And this, of course, is in regards to Armenia as well as territories of the former Republic of Iraq. Saddam Hussein's Iraq is still really sort of in the works. And I think some of these Kurdish territories in the north can really be divided amongst these two nations and sort of dealt with. I think this is a combined front. And of course, the PKK doesn't really bring sympathy. This is the essentially the Marxist-Leninist party, this rebel group, which emerged in the 1960s and 70s in Iraq and southern Turkey, and they've been responsible for like terrorist acts on Turkish territory. But these are essentially socialist Kurds who fight for a weird Vladimir Lenin / Woodrow Wilson. So this is the American president who was the president during the Russian Revolution as well as the First World War, a very sort of Masonic type presidential figure. He actually oversaw the bringing of Trotsky and some of these other demonic, like Talmudic figures into Russia. Actually, so when you hear about Trotsky's ship arriving in Europe with all these like Talmudic commandos, that's Woodrow Wilson's signature right there. So he was actually overseeing the February-October Revolution in Russia, the Russian Civil War, and all of those particular acts, and even the ritual murder of the Romanovs. So quite interesting connections there. But Woodrow Wilson and Vladimir Lenin developed this idea of like a nation state. Every nation should have its own state. There should be this weird right that all people should have their own sovereign state. I mean, we can probably discuss this with either Andrei Afanasyev or a future guest, I think, more in depth, because it's a really philosophical and politological idea, which frankly is emerged after the French Revolution, really doesn't have any connections to the Middle Ages or even ancient history. In fact, it's quite new, and this is what the Kurds are really appealing to. And so the PKK doesn't really raise any sympathy, I think, with myself or Conrad, but it's interesting how Turkey still sees them as this particular enemy, this weird tumor which it has to remove, and it's striking now while it has time, while people are distracted by the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Not saying that it's an actual distraction. I mean, it's a real issue happening in the south, but while there's all this commotion and kerfuffle, they can actually strike south and perhaps cut out a piece for themselves amidst this great division of the Middle East, a sort of re-emergent, division similar to what we saw after the falling apart of the British and French empires, and of course, for following World War II. So I think there's a lot to it, and naturally, like in terms of like Kurdish suppression in Iraq, like we know Saddam Hussein did have some interesting moves against the Kurdish population because the Iran was funding, say, Kurdish separatism during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, but Kurdish representation in Iraq has always been like kind of an existent thing. Like the Kurds have always had some sort of autonomy, or at least culturally speaking. And even the current president of Iraq, in fact, is an ethnic Kurd, and he's also a member of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which is like a moderate Kurdistan identity group, which has some political actions in modern Iraq. So you can't really say that Iraq itself is anti-Kurdish, because they do have actual Kurdish elites amongst their people. And yes, Kurdistan never really existed historically as an entity, but the Kurds have always experienced the sign of some sort of respect and even admiration, I think, due to the figures that they've produced throughout Islamic history in the Middle East. So I don't think the Kurds are exactly an oppressed people, maybe akin to the modern Palestinians. So I think the sort of cry for assistance from the PKK is a little bit misplaced, especially given their, as you said, like the Druze are satanic, and these Marxist-Leninist PKK are also satanic in their own weird Talmudic Rothschild type fashion, right? Just like the Bolsheviks were during the Russian Revolution. But yeah, just mentioning the Druze, right? We saw this weird. So notice how the satanic cults of the Middle East and even around the world, I would say even during the Russian First Civil War, even during the Russian First World War, we had these Tolstoy-sided pacifists. Like it's always the satanic, weird, heretical cults. I'm not saying that Islam in and of itself is like a heretical movement, but even like these weird pagan little religions are always very pacifist. Even Anton LaVey was like anti-war and stuff like that. It's like very weird how they try to associate peace with their satanic, weird pagan beliefs. Quite curious, because the Druze, again, even in 2015, despite the fact that they didn't really openly oppose the Assad government, they actually resisted being conscripted while Syria was being torn apart by ISIS in 2015 and 16, being torn apart by the PKK, all these various Western-backed resistance groups. The Druze were actually, they stated they're going to stand down and just allow all these groups to take over. So they weren't going to assist the Assad, their own government. They said this is zero patriotism from the Satanists, basically, is what we're saying here. And this is a real concern, I think, for the future in terms of tolerating all religions within a particular country. You do have to make sure, like, if you have Manichaeans, various heretics of different sorts, just like during the Byzantine Empire, these people were internally monitored because, well, if a war breaks up, and inside the country there are these groups which cause disruption, chaos, and perhaps even refuse to resist the enemy when they come to the gates. I mean, this is very shall we say. It's almost behavior which belongs to a certain group of people, which can't really name openly on YouTube, but it's not just unique to that particular group. It's also unique to all these other pagan heretical groups. This is what we see throughout Byzantine history as well. So very concerned, but again, not surprised that the Druze are taking this particular position on the Assad government. The Assad government is one of the most well sort of meaning regime in the Middle East at the moment in terms of respecting Christianity, respecting Islam, despite the fact that Bashar Assad himself and his family, they belong to a particular sect of Islam, which really isn't mainstream, the Alawite cult. So it's just curious that Assad is always the target of all these foreign attacks. It's like nobody wants a moderate pro-Christian Middle East. Everybody wants a radical regime there. And yes, I mean, Jordan at the moment is this sort of peaceful type place. You know, the last Hashemite king does rule in Jordan, but it does kind of push you towards this idea that whoever's acting from the outside, maybe even Israel, this creation of more and more influential Israel would mean that its outskirts, these buffer zones, would need to be chaotic. And unfortunately, one of those buffer zones does fall on Syria. So Syria, according to the Israeli Anglo-American plan, does need to be in a state of perpetual chaos, like this big wasteland. And of course, this is reflected in the fact that the ancient city of Antioch lies in ruins. So this is the ancient Christian city, and there's no chance of even rebuilding it because, again, the country of Syria itself is in current ruins at the moment. So it's just this weird state of apocalyptic commotion up north there, just north of Armageddon, north of Megiddo. It's a very apocalyptic imagery, I think, for Christians to sort of consider the fact that what's taking place in Syria right now may be the model for the entire Middle East if the plans of the Anglo-American establishment, the globalists and the Zionists, go ahead.
Very well said. Moving away from the Middle East, I think we covered most of the bases there. Of course, we're constantly watching the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We see more and more escalations from these settler groups and rabbi groups trying to do things there. You know, the Red Heifer and these sorts of things, the Temple Institute, these settler institutions. There's all of this civil society pressure on Israel to succeed and pursue their maximalist aims from a ethno-religious perspective. So no matter what you hear from the cabinet and how some of them may want to tone this thing down, they are being pressured from all sides of world Jewry to move forward with this and make greater Israel and all of that. But moving to Russia, the other major conflict, which is really heating up, probably the most we've seen in months and months and months at this point. We are seeing Russia advance across all of the fronts. They have taken Robotine on the Zaporozhye front. They have moved well past Avdiivka forward in the Avdiivka front, Archangelskoye, all these other places along Donetsk, Luhansk, into the Kharkov region. The city of Kharkov itself has been under air raid alarm for well over 24 hours at this point. It's broken, I think, the continuous air raid alarm that was set in February 2022. So it's very clear that Kharkov, Zaporozhye, these are the next targets, and we're really about to see some major Russian advances in that direction. We hear that Zelensky has been declared a criminal, that the Russian prosecutor's office have opened investigations against him. There is warrants for his arrest, which is very dramatic. We have heard about the May 20th date after that, perhaps Russia striking Zelensky, moving in on him, all sorts of possibilities about how they could escalate this diplomatically with how they recognize the supposed president of Ukraine. But Syrskyi is surrendering all across the front line. He's talking about Chasiv Yar and how that right now is what needs to be protected the most because if that falls, it will open up the entire front line for all sorts of new Russian cauldrons and advances. So it's really quite the collapse we are seeing Ukraine experience right now. They, of course, just received $60+ billion from the U.S., but we're hearing word that if they don't continue to get that aid regularly, they could collapse within 2 weeks. And then we hear the Ukrainians saying that Russia could take the Baltics in less than 7 days, that NATO's response time is 14 days, all of these sorts of things. So the Ukrainians are blackpilling. You have Arestovich talking all about how it's totally over after he's since fled. And yet at the same time, Putin and Zelensky still can't even agree on something like a Pascha ceasefire. Zelensky still is that committed to retaking Crimea, of all things. So Dmitry, I'm wondering your thoughts on the developments in Russia, Ukraine, and when do you think some of these big Russian pushes may come, and what comes after that?
I think, look, we're looking towards the 9th of May as the big sort of moment on the calendar where Putin can actually voice his opinion as to what's taking place on the front lines without any further criticism. In fact, he'll have the liberty to perhaps even proclaim war or mobilization or something really patriotic of that kind, sort of very, I would say, warlike, or at least to push the war into a certain direction. The SMO, I mean, this is what Patriarch Kirill called the sacred war at this point, right? So essentially, now that holy war has been declared against Ukraine due to the persecution of the Orthodox Church, I think it's very clear that we can openly be calling it a war, not really an SMO any longer. I think it has been upgraded in the eyes of many Christians in Russia. But the next moves, I think, would be, it's very interesting because the Russian position, notice the greatest defensive at the moment, and the fighting during this Passion Week, and of course probably moving into Bright Week as well, was actually, and unfortunately, there was no sort of ceasefire during Easter. That was, the Zelensky government simply declined to provide that, and so the Russians can't really put down their arms during Easter. They have a duty to protect the Orthodox people of Lugansk, Donetsk, and the Russian population. So they really need to be on guard and continue the fighting, because if one side, it has to be a mutual ceasefire sort of deal, but that simply didn't take place this weekend. But Chasov Yar, right, this little town just west of Bakhmut. This is down a major highway which leads from Donetsk into Zaporozhye. The Zaporozhye is the main city which Russia simply hasn't taken during the entire operation. Zaporozhye is the city next door to Dnipropetrovsk, which is again this future capital of whatever New Heavenly Jerusalem, or perhaps New Khazaria, whatever they're trying to build. It's a really popular city amongst the Judeo-Ukrainian elites. It's where most of these, it's where Zelensky was born. It's where Kolomoisky was born. All these major Jewish oligarchic figures in Ukraine, essentially just check their Wikipedias, are all somehow related to this particular city. But the main highway that leads to that city, of course, goes through past Chasov Yar, and Chasov Yar is a small town, maybe 12,000 people at most. At this point, the news have reported in Ukrainian news that the city is actually completely depopulated. Less than 1,000 people live there at the moment, so everyone's been evacuated. Major fighting between Russians and Ukrainians in Chasov Yar. But what's curious is Chasov Yar leads to Zaporozhye and doesn't necessarily lead to these two major towns, north, which is Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, and that leads to Izyum and Kharkov. So Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, of course, you will remember those two cities from 2014-15 campaigns when Strelkov was holding Slavyansk, and these are two fortress cities which, interestingly enough, even during the 2022 Russian invasion, these two cities were not actually taken. So the initial invasion wave by the Russian forces actually went around Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, and even cities like Bakhmut, because it was actually looked at, these two cities, they're very close. They're maybe 10 kilometers apart, which is why we're kind of speaking of them kind of as a pair. So they're a lot closer than, say, even Belgorod and Kharkov are. These two particular cities are very major targets, but they're, if you can imagine, Bakhmut and Avdiivka are very well fortified. Slavyansk-Kramatorsk there's probably like a Helm's Deep situation going on there, so it'll be a hard sort of acorn to crack. And so perhaps the Russians are taking a different approach, maybe connecting Donetsk and Zaporozhye a bit closer down the highway past Chasov Yar. So it's a pretty positive development. After Chasov Yar, perhaps the Russians will move on to Konstantinovka, and then openly the fields of Zaporozhye will be right before them, and further maybe reconnection between the Russian fronts in Donetsk, the Donetsk People's Republic, and Zaporozhye will take place. And then the Russians will have a choice. Do they go for Kramatorsk, Slavyansk? Or do they maybe hold the line there and perhaps go for a bigger target? Maybe, we mentioned the Odessa offensive, Nikolaev offensive, perhaps even the surround of Kharkov, which is a major project. This would be the biggest step in the entire SMO since the 2022 major offensive, I think, in the first place. So the Russians, the chips are on the Russian side, and Ukrainians are, now that they've received sort of F-16 training and the Abrams tanks are kind of in storage, the Abrams tanks have been moved to, unironically, not even Plan B or C, they moved back to Plan Z. They're somewhere in the Lvov station in barracks, or being hidden, being camouflaged, hiding them away from long-range Russian missile strikes, because Americans have told the Ukrainians not to use Abrams anymore until the last line of defense, because the Abrams are being shown in clips all over YouTube and other places being destroyed by Russian drones and Russian anti-tank missiles. Unfortunately, the Abrams tanks have been greatly disrespected in this conflict. We are noticing naturally that the Ukrainians are asking for Reaper drones. These are the massive, like, Sudan level, and I mean by sedan as in like the car, the vehicle. The weight of these drones is close to 2,000 kilograms in terms of if they're actually carrying munitions, large wingspans. These are essentially big flying cars with huge wings. Of course, the Reaper drones, the cost of them is very expensive. They, you need to be a very experienced drone fighter pilot. It's not just the remote control car that you're utilizing here. It's the drones worth over 30 to 40 million American dollars each. And the Russians have destroyed some of these American drones over the Black Sea. We remember them. The Russian planes actually spilling oil on one of these drones and actually causing it to crash into the Black Sea without even shooting it. We've seen these drones shot down by the Houthis. We've seen them shot down by Iran as well. So in the past, these drones, they do get shot down, but they are very effective at, these drones, I think, if you recall the Obama administration, this is what Obama used to actually slay civilians all over the Middle East during his 2-year tenureship. So these are the particular weapons of choice. And of course, Ukrainians want a bit of that destructive power in order to strike it. Of course, not just the Russian civilians and civilians in eastern Ukraine, but also Russian forces. So of course, the Reaper drones are the weapons of choice here. But generally speaking, the Russian side has progressed quite heavily on almost every front. Rabotino is taken, Chasiv Yar is being fought over. I don't think Chasiv Yar will hold very long because, again, it's only a small town and village. It's not like a Bakhmut or an Avdiivka. So generally speaking, very positive developments for Russia over Passion Week and Bright Week. And on the other bright side, Donetsk, Lugansk, Belgorod, Bryansk, they haven't really been bombed by Ukraine as well. So Ukraine has really held back. Perhaps the morale is low. Perhaps all the Syrskyi blackpilling messages, the commander of the Ukrainian force is actually sending out this message that Ukraine isn't doing too well. 61 billion hasn't really hit Ukraine. It's almost like a heroin addict. Sure, it's injected the particular drug of choice, but it hasn't necessarily felt the effect yet. So again, will Ukrainian morale rise after the 61 billion is felt, or perhaps will it be smuggled away and the corruption money will sort of spread it very thin amongst the country and its forces? We'll kind of see, I think, in the coming weeks. But we are looking forward to that 9th of May Putin announcement, because this will determine the Russian offensive, I think, going forward, and will kind of paint a road forward, I think, for the Russian side. And even morale-wise, it'll be very important to sort of explain what's been happening. Perhaps Putin will award some people or even mention some of the heroes of the Avdiivka Bakhmut campaigns of former years. So we are kind of looking forward to that day in the middle of Bright Week. I think it'll be Thursday or Wednesday next week when the 9th of May parade will take place, and of course Putin's speech, followed by a display of the martial prowess of the Russian army on the Red Square.
Speaking of Russian military displays in Moscow, we've seen all these videos of these big exhibits displaying the Western hardware that has been captured along the front lines in Ukraine. We see Abrams tanks, Leopards, Bradleys, a whole bunch of other things that have been, destroyed or partially immobilized on the front lines that have been taken to Russia as sort of this flex. We see all these Russian people coming and taking pictures and touching the barrels of the tanks and taking selfies and everything. So quite an interesting day out with the family if you're in Russia to go see some Western hardware. But as far as escalations from the West, we're hearing, again, it's just Macron. Everybody else is basically recognizing that it's the beginning of the end of the Ukraine meme. But Macron is holding on for dear life. He told the Rothschild-owned Economist, "I have a clear strategic objective. Russia cannot win in Ukraine. If Russia wins in Ukraine, there will not be security in Europe." And of all people that come out against him, David Cameron comes out and says that he's going too far, that the rest of Europe and the NATO allies do not immediately want troops on the ground in Ukraine. So Macron is sort of the maverick on this, which is quite interesting because these other characters you kind of would consider to be more hawkish than Macron himself. Macron himself was not, initially at least, I felt the most eager to be against Russia, although he did immediately start firing his generals that expressed on TV or behind the scenes that they can't win against Russia, that Russia has a legitimate claim in Ukraine. Some of these other things were made by more experienced French military leaders, and they were dismissed post-haste. So perhaps he was behind the scenes really clearing things out within his administration and within the military-industrial complex of France so that he could go all in on this anti-Russia crusade. It's a very interesting development, and it's just funny that David Cameron would be telling somebody that you're being too hawkish. But you mentioned May 9th and everything, and, the passing of May, meaning the end of Zelensky's legitimacy and the ushering in of Putin's new term that he just won the election for. And we know that Putin, one of the first things he's going to be doing is visiting and meeting with Xi Jinping. The Russia-Chinese alliance has dramatically increased. We hear Western reports that now Russia is directly working with China, perhaps on their plans to retake Taiwan and reunify it forcibly. And we know that China is also the #1 provider of military hardware and other military elements to Russia. So the Sino-Russo alliance is stronger than ever. But unless you have anything else to say perhaps about the front in Ukraine, Dmitry, there have been some developments in Africa with the new Wagner group that has been integrated into the Russian armed forces, and it appears that perhaps there are even Russian troops on the same base in Niger as U.S. troops, which is really spooking people and is getting all of the military bloggers talking.
I think the African connection is very important because, again, France receives 60+% of its uranium actually from the West African, former, in brackets, in parentheses, former colonies, allegedly, that, it used to hold in those West African countries. One of those places, of course, is Niger, which naturally at the moment, the coup has taken place and Wagner is all over the country. They're so-called Russian specialists. So these are people and professionals from Russia who don't even belong to Wagner, but will work alongside Wagner, advising some of these coup leaders in these West African nations. And, these people are fighting against France and against even, I would say, US, UK influence, because all these countries are essentially divided amongst UK influenced nations, these African countries, and French countries. And, their interests don't always align because, again, you could say the Shabbos-Goy division amongst European countries is still quite real. Like UK has its own elites, right, which are, ethnically English and Anglo. And then you have the French elites who essentially want prosperity for their own French people. I mean, not even people, for their own elites first and foremost, despite what the Talmudic elites, overarching and globally like an umbrella watches over the entire project, of course, that kind of brings everybody into place. But these people, their greed, pushed by various demons, is seeking out further prosperity in exploiting African peoples. Unfortunately, the reality of colonialism sort of reigns true to this point. But Wagner is fighting against that in Western Africa, kind of giving the African people, and I don't want to sound like a BLM activist, but they're giving the African people a chance at some sort of independent development moving forward. And perhaps this will align with the Russian Orthodox Exarchate's position, again, on the African continent, I would say, with Bishop Constantine of Zaraisk really pushing this pilgrimage and various missionary work along the African continent, traveling from country to country, visiting all these African parishes, laying on hands, making new priests, deacons, and monks amongst the African people. I think these two particular interests are aligned. You have the worldly and the spiritual all together in one, and I would say it's just a very curious synthesis that, in a way, this weird secular type modern age maybe even postmodern symphonia happening in Africa at the moment. But generally speaking, yes. So there's, I think, two angles to this particular African story. Is that on one hand you do have General Struvic and you have actual specialists working alongside Wagner, really high level military experts who could be working on bolstering some of these African nations to fight back against American French influence, and they could be targeting French energy interests or even blackmailing France in terms of, claiming, well, if Macron, if you continue, posturing in Romania and some of these, in your Western Ukrainian projects, we can at least strike at the lifeblood of France at the moment, because 80% of French energy comes from uranium and comes from nuclear power, which France was very sort of capable and well-meaning to develop that particular energy, because it is a very clean form of energy in Western Europe. France was one of the smartest countries, I think, on the European continent to sort of develop these things after the Second World War, similar to Japan in that particular case, and it benefited greatly. But naturally, if its sort of connection to this raw energy resource is cut in Africa, of course, they'll experience major issues at home domestically. So perhaps Russia is keeping its sort of finger on that particular vein in Western Africa. And the other consideration, of course, is the remaining American bases in West Africa. We saw footage of Russians essentially encircling and even patrolling past American bases, which is concerning in terms of, well, the World War III type potential. I mean, all you're going to need is a Russian specialist or a Russian Wagner forces group essentially slaying an American soldier who's, unfortunately someone, from the south or from the north of America, stationed, unfortunately, somewhere in West Africa to support globalist interests. All you'll need is an American base attacked. And, will it be reacted to in a similar way to Benghazi and Libya in some of these places? Will America simply ignore the losses which it carries, or will it sort of push this patriotic need to sort of strike Russia officially now in the open and sort of start a really hot World War III? It could be one of those ignition points, Conrad. It could be one of those moments, the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand type situation happening. And I mean, there's a lot of those pressure points already created around the world, like the invasion of Taiwan potentially, or the striking against an American aircraft carrier, all these false flag, black swan type locations. This could be another one in West Africa, I think, unfortunately, because there are still American troops stationed there. For some reason, the Trump administration didn't pull them out, neither did the Biden administration. And American interests in West Africa are very questionable, I think, to begin with. Yes, the UK has influences going and interests going back to the British Empire. The French, of course, have energy interests, but what does the US actually gain from being amidst these, sub-Saharan sort of African people who have very complex cultures and very complex and, I would say, tangled histories with European invaders, colonialists, and even traders in the past? I think it's just a very concerning history. US should not be involved in this area at all, and even, I think, more so than, say, Russians who are trying to at least rebuild it and perhaps push it onto a path of Christianity. So there is a mix of missionary work as well as perhaps a Soviet-style liberation movement going on here in the West, on the West African continent.
We're seeing in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and all these town squares, they'll have the Russian flag, the Malian flag, the Burkina Faso flag, and the Niger flag, which is they're the three main countries that have fully embraced the Russian influence, the Russian troops, and have expelled their French and United States actors that were acting within their country, extracting their resources, acting in a military fashion. So very interesting developments in Africa. We're going to talk more about some things going on in Africa on the ecclesial side that maybe we will call for Russian troops in that situation as well. But before we get there, we have to talk about the situation in Georgia, which is escalating. We know that the Georgian Dream Party has moved forward with passing their anti-foreign agent bill. They are rejecting the globalist president's attempt at vetoing it, and now all of the civil society groups, all of the Western-backed puppets have been fully mobilized. The U.S. is claiming that this bill will totally bring Georgia back into the Russian sphere of influence, despite the fact that it is not pro-Russian in any way. It's just anti-foreign agent. This would also apply to Russian foreign agents, but the U.S. have been so deep in Georgia with their NGOs and these other things that they are terrified at losing this southern flank with which they can bother Russia from. And the claims now is that the Georgian Dream Party and their leading oligarch are entirely Russian-backed, despite the fact that in many ways they have overseen all sorts of, basic Georgia versus Russian actions, because they're still in a very low-grade war conflict, technically. I mean, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are not recognized even by most Russian allies around the world, let alone normal countries that are just observing from afar. So the Georgian-Russian situation is obviously tense, but the Georgian Dream Party have witnessed the pride parades every year. They've witnessed what they call Ukrainization occur in Ukraine that they do not want to be like. They are saying that this bill will help them prevent being turned into Ukraine. And I mentioned the arrest warrant earlier for Zelensky. That actually is also towards Poroshenko. And the Georgians, I mean, they had Saakashvili for a while, who was basically their version of Poroshenko, but even more insane. He was also, ironically, a Ukrainian politician as well, this weird connection between all these Ukrainians and Georgians. But in the streets, protesting against this foreign agent bill, we've seen the U.S. again condemn it, despite the fact that it's basically the same as the U.S. FARA law, which requires foreign agents to register as well. So it's completely hypocritical. But where most of the groups we're seeing mobilized are liberal groups, gay groups, pro-EU groups. We're seeing a lot of EU flags. But also they've mobilized some of these quote-unquote National Socialist, Georgian nationalist people that are the ones that provide the manpower for these Georgian legions in Ukraine, these super anti-Russian, quote-unquote far-right. I'm very skeptical. I'm sure they are funded by Semitic money. But they have been in the streets as well, siding with the pro-EU people. I think they're really more there to start violence against pro-Georgian, sovereignty actors. So very interesting developments on the ground in Georgia, to say the least. But Dimitri, unless you have anything to say on that or anything else in the Caucasus, of course, we still see Azerbaijan and Turkey threatening Armenia. In many ways, I'm sure Turkey is considering all of that in lieu of their Syria and Iraq advancements. They really are forming, as you said, this sort of Turkic zone that we've talked about in the past, how with the prophecies that we know will come to pass, that it could really come back to bite Russia later down the line. And I think they would be remiss not to be a little more skeptical of this Azerbaijani growth. And that ultimately comes back to them fully embracing, this sort of perspective on Israel and the world Zionist entity, and how, they can't really play both sides. You need to firmly come out against them, which means firmly coming out against evil, which I think puts you on the right side of history, as it were. But yeah, the southern front in Russia, the Georgians are thankfully moving somewhat in the right direction. However, you mentioned France and everybody else, Iran also supporting Armenia. It appears that they are facing a lot of pressure there. But unless you have anything else to say about that, we could probably move on to some of this church stuff.
Yeah, I think that there's just a weird connection, which we will probably mention in future episodes. And I think we do need to keep it in mind because, as we spoke about, there is this Turkic axis, the Zio-Turkic alliance. And essentially, Khazaria was this alliance between the Turkic mass population of the North Caucasus with the Judaic, a certain former tribe of Israel, which essentially united and formed the elite of that country. But this alliance, this Zio-Azerbaijani Turkic alliance being formed between Central Asian countries, Azerbaijan and Turkey, this new sort of axis of resistance to, I think, European, the Arabic Sunni countries, as well as, by Sunni, I mean, well, those countries dominated by Mecca, Medina, of course, in the south, Iran included, is being formed. And Russia's reaction to it, I think, will be very key going forward. But another country's reaction, I think, the European Union, with a lot of concern, views, I think, this Turkish belt as a sort of, I think, an opponent, an economic enemy, someone who will maybe challenge some of its links, because the European Union does trade very heavily with China. So again, this new Silk Road being developed between all these Turkic nations may be a point of concern, I think, for future Europeans. And European economy is, of course, suffering. The euro is falling in value. So a vital connection to China, of course, is important. And they can't really afford a lot of this, a lot of these countries in these Turkic states, placing tariffs on exports and imports coming out of China there, and sort of connecting China to Europe through this massive land route for essentially that Middle East and Central Asian zone. So what's the alternative here? I think it's that weird connection we see between Macron, France, Armenia, Iran as well, I would say, and possibly even Georgia, because French-Georgian connections are actually very strong, and France has been investing in Georgia as well as Armenia very heavily over the last few decades. It's a really curious connection. What could be the French connection to Armenia and Georgia? And perhaps this has something to do with the fact that Armenians are also the largest and perhaps richest minority in Iran itself. So the Armenian presence in Persia, Iran, as well as perhaps the French connections to Iran. And we know, France is a member of the EU, a member of NATO, so naturally, them being Zionists, they're also opposed to Iran in a very sort of simplistic geopolitical sense. But we do need to recall that once the Shah was deposed and Ruhollah Khomeini, the first supreme leader of Iran, actually arrived in Iran, he came from France, and he arrived on an Air France plane. And when we speak about the Hashemite kings of Jordan, Syria, and Iraq in the past, and we call them British puppets and puppets of the British Empire and the British Commonwealth, we kind of say that in passing, and that's kind of comes naturally. But perhaps we could view Iran as a sort of potential, maybe long-term, and perhaps this is, maybe there are secret codes planted into the genus and to the particular genesis of the Iranian state, which connects it to France in a very deep, perhaps Masonic, esoteric way. The French sort of Shia connection, I think, could be explored in future episodes. And in fact, it could even be the connection exists through the Armenian elites, right? Because our Armenian elites are still flourishing in Iran. They've never really been oppressed. And this is the connection of Iran to Armenia today, which Iran's opposition to Azerbaijan accentuates that. And, again, Iran's opposition to Turkey as well is for the sort of the viable leader. Will it be the Sunnis who lead the Muslim world, or the Shias, the Persian versus the Ottoman Empire? These conflicts, of course, go centuries back into the past, right? And of course, Georgia is caught amidst all of it. Georgia historically, of course, affected by both the Ottomans and bullied by the Shia Persians over the last few centuries, since I think for the last 800 years, you can say, very, very much so. And it's caught amidst all of this. We do see this French connection. Could the French be figuring out an alternative trade route to this Turkish belt being developed across the center of the world, maybe from China to Iran, Armenia, Georgia, and through the Black Sea, through maybe the port of Constance into Europe? So there could be major economic sort of developments going into the future. Perhaps this is where French investment is actually aiming towards. This is the French sort of Turkish opposition. And it could also explain why the French are investing as well heavily into Greek military, why the French are actually banking on having this Greco-phile type position, when in fact Greece at the moment is confirmed to be the second poorest country in Europe after Bulgaria, which really doesn't say much because unfortunately Bulgaria, since even the Soviet Union days, hasn't really been doing too well. So I think it's just a curious sort of futuristic prognosis. Maybe France is developing an alternative to the Turkic, sort of Belt and Road Initiative, you can say, or the sort of Silk trade route being worked on there through Iran, Armenia, Georgia. So I think we'll be looking out for that and sort of reading up on any news as to how that's moving forward in the future. But naturally, all of this strikes the symbols of religion in this particular region, because we know the oppression of Christians follows very closely after any sort of military engagement, especially Armenia. We know there's going to be new news about Armenian churches being bombed. We've seen the persecution in Australia of the Assyrian priest being stabbed by an Islamic extremist. These things kind of follow any sort of conflict, especially amongst the sort of mentally ill extremist type elements in the Middle East. These people are exacerbated and caused to essentially take on really fundamentalist elements within their nature when they witness conflicts. I mean, this is what happens when demons of bloodshed and slaughter and murdering of others actually take over a particular society, and war is felt. There are all these events taking place, I think, within the souls of people. And so I think we'll see definitely more persecutions of Christians in the Middle East if any sort of major war takes place between Azerbaijan and Armenia, or even further, if, say, Azerbaijan and Iran have a war. I mean, the Orthodox community in Azerbaijan will be negatively affected, I think, generally, and that's speaking for Russians in particular, who have a really large community in Baku and other places on the Caspian Sea. So just very concerning, I think, for Christian across the board, being the minorities in all these countries, really not having a say and being essentially the pawns of fate. But you can always rely on God, rely on his protection and his divine providence to sort of guide you through these tribulations and tough times, I think, especially moving forward, because tough times will definitely come. We can't have like a really hopeful message, Conrad, in terms of we have to stick to the facts, and the facts, of course, state that there won't be any peaceful sort of resolution to some of these events in the Middle East. The Gordian knot has to be cut through the middle, because again, those people who tied it were not Christians in the first place. Notice the people who drew all these Middle Eastern borders were essentially Freemasons. All these countries were laid down through occult rituals, and it's not just the Druze who, of course, have these satanic connections. It's people who like the folks who run Ukraine at the moment. It's just straight up Talmudic magic which laid down some of these borders in the Middle East, and this is why the Zionist state of Israel sort of reigns supreme in this particular region today. And it's sort of futuristic projects, they just lash out and push forward, cause disarray and corruption, scandal within the region itself. So I think religious persecution is a massive element in this particular region and its history.
Well, you mentioned France and all of their alliances. Perhaps when Gabriel Doroshin ascends to the Russian throne, that will bring France into the Russian sphere of influence, allowing their anti-Turkic infrastructure that they've been building now to aid Russia in their inevitable war against a Kemalist Turkey. So, we can all dream, right? We can all predict how this is going to go down. I thought that was kind of funny. But you spoke of religion. We talked about Africa before. I made that joke about Wagner troops perhaps helping the religious situation in Africa, and that is because, unfortunately, this is from Aristomenes Papadimitriou, who is a leftist worker for GoArch who covers these things. He posted an image. It said, on May 2nd, 2024, Mother Angelic Molen was ordained deaconess by Metropolitan Seraphim Kikotis of Zimbabwe in St. Nectarios Mission, which is in Waterfall, Zimbabwe, with the approval and support of Patriarch Theodoros and the Synod of the Patriarch of Alexandria. And the picture shows an African woman in deacon's vestments serving communion on the spoon to parishioners, which is a total scandal. This is not a deaconess as it was historically understood. This is a female deacon. She was at the altar. She was vested liturgically. She was performing litanies and, again, communing the faithful. So this is, of course, a dramatic scandal. Dr. Carrie Frederick Frost, the feminist, progressive leader of the St. Phoebe Center for Deaconesses, was present at this ordination, and this information has since been posted. We'll have it linked below. We encourage everybody to write an email and complain to the Patriarchate of Alexandria and the Metropolis of Zimbabwe and all of these institutions within the Patriarchate. And everybody was saying, and I said this on Twitter, that this is just a huge vindication for the African exarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church in Africa. So I can already see hundreds of missions and churches deciding to go under them just because of this nonsense occurring. And everybody online, Sarah Riccardi Schwartz, all these people, they're calling everybody sexist, racist, all these things for being against this. But this is a horrible, horrible accretion. So, and if it takes Wagner troops going in and doing a coup in Zimbabwe to stop this, I support that too. So you heard it here first. This is a very unfortunate development, but the Patriarch of Alexandria, the Patriarchate, they decided to surpass the EP, the worst elements of the Church of Greece, the worst elements even in places like Finland, frankly, and become the forerunner of the Antichrist agenda within the Orthodox Church. So be sure to pray for the canonical church in Alexandria, because this is a very unfortunate development.
Yes, very sad news, I think, but not surprising, during Passion Week of all days, and it did take place on Great Wednesday, right? So this is the day on which Judas actually betrayed Christ and his apostles, right? Giving Christ the kiss of betrayal, the kiss of the betrayer on the cheek, and actually pointing him out to the troops of the Sanhedrin. And on that particular day, it seems that the ordination, this unlawful satanic practice, actually took place. And I want to call it satanic because, I mean, that's exactly what it is. It's a heresy of the highest order. This is a breach of Orthodox Church tradition. And yes, if you say, well, it doesn't actually breach any sort of canon, I'm sorry, but not all the church laws and really strong dogmatic traditions are actually actually codicized in the canons. We aren't, Talmudic Pharisees here. Not everything is written into the law, in fact. And a lot of canons aren't followed to begin with anyway, which is a major problem, I think, and something that, the Orthodox Christian bishops really need to tackle, I think, in order to bring further strictness into the church practice, especially after the tumultuous and very cringe, bizarre 20th century, I think, in terms of church policies and exactly what has been taking place. But, these bizarre policies push on this new Meletios Metaxarchus figure, Patriarch Theodore II of Alexandria. I was suspicious about His Eminence Theodore II for a little while after he supported Epiphany, the false Metropolitan of Kiev, in 2018, and then of course co-served with him, I believe, during COVID. So essentially bringing a layperson into the altar is probably equivalent to ordaining this particular deaconess and actually co-serving with a guy dressed in bishop robes without actually being a blessed bishop of the church. I mean, this is just as much of a LARP and just as much of a schismatic, heretical act as what we saw, this Passion Week. I don't have anything good to say. There's no redeeming qualities. I don't think this is a case of, well, if we bring nuance and economy, there's no economy here. This is pure heresy, pure fuel for schism. And in fact, my church, the Russian Orthodox Church, has not been commemorating Patriarch Theodore II of Alexandria for a good 5 to 6 years now. So in fact, yes, we don't actually acknowledge or accept his actions or the actions of his synod at all. And in fact, this is the entire synod. We can't just say, oh, it's because Patriarch Theodore II is a bad patriarch or, a false bishop, or maybe he's a heretic personally. No. All the bishops on the synod of the African Alexandrian Greek jurisdiction actually went along with this, right? We don't hear any voices of opposition, do we, Conrad? It's all like either silence or it's completely accepting it, which is very, very concerning. I think, for that particular archdiocese, but also almost providentially do we see the working of the Holy Spirit, which brings great enlightenment, I think, to all of us, because many didn't really understand why did the Russian Orthodox Church, I mean, almost push sort of irrationally towards the creation of the Exarchate of Africa, right? Sort of to administer and provide missionary work to the local African parishes in order for them not to co-serve with schismatic Ukrainians. It's almost as if that entire creation was the work of the Holy Spirit, because now these Africans will have an alternative. These African priests, clergy, laity will have an alternative not to actually participate in this lawless misadventure, which now may spread across all these African dioceses under Alexandria, because this creates a really dangerous precedent if this is not, this action is not chastised and not denounced. And it doesn't look like, it's been a few days now. It is Easter. Maybe people are, feasting and whatnot, which they should be in the first place. But it does, we will see in the next few weeks what the reaction will be from the other Greek jurisdictions. If this is not denounced openly, this will create a real precedent. And so we may be seeing the Archbishop Irenaeus of Athens, for example, even Patriarch Bartholomew is going to play catch up a little bit, you know what I'm saying? And he's going to be ordaining deaconesses or female deacons as in this case. And, of course, this deaconess discussion is that's not what the church needs at the moment, I think, in any capacity. And I'm saying this as someone who's been an Orthodox Christian essentially since the cradle. This is really not what the church requires, not in this modern particular setting. I think I could challenge most people on that in terms of a debate. And I think people would agree with me. All the priests and people in clergy and laity who I've spoken to really agree that the real concern here is missionary work through the internet and other avenues, spreading the light of orthodoxy to the global population, to various nations, tribes, and peoples around the world. It's not to bring back these old traditions from the first centuries before monasticism even existed. You have to keep in mind, deaconesses were a thing before female monasteries even existed, right, on earth. People don't realize the context of deaconesses and the reality of the modern Orthodox Church, the sort of context in which this particular lawless action was taking place. So yes, this is a satanic development. The Holy Spirit was not, I can say this, I think, with pure confidence, and I know I don't like making these sort of statements, but we can say with confidence, I think, Conrad, that the Holy Spirit was not present when this decision was being made. It was made with complete sort of demonic infusion. This is a decision of a person who's being demonized, and I think we should all pray for that particular bishop, because when St. John Chrysostom says the majority of bishops are not going to heaven, I think when we're talking about 51% here, I'm not sure where this particular hierarch falls on which side of the ratio here, but I think this event kind of shows us what's taking place. And we can kind of, the analogy we can make is, well, imagine if we heard Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, make the heretical proclamation that the Mother of God is in fact not the Theotokos, that she is just, the Mother of Jesus or something like that. If we heard that and it was published on YouTube or something, or even published, the news story is published, this is how it would have felt. This is the level of scandalization we're experiencing. We shouldn't be surprised. Heresy has always tried to make its way into the church, tried to divide people. So this is just a new day, a new story. We have to take it as we go and just reject it, and just clearly don't play with it, don't flirt with it, don't play footsie with this particular thing. No nuance is acceptable here. It just needs to be rejected, denounced outright. I think that is the strong stance which I think most hierarchs will take. And I believe the Russian Orthodox Church Exarch Bishop Constantine of Zaraisk, who is now the Russian Exarch in Africa, once he makes a statement, I think we'll have a clear path forward as to how to respond and how to, I think, openly what kind of a stance to have on this particular issue, which we can actually sign our names under.
I totally agree. And again, you mentioned monasticism. This person is not a female monastic. As far as we can tell, they either were married or were widowed. So we discussed this in the past. They are not a virgin, as was often prescribed for deaconesses. So this is just a total accretion. This is total nonsense. And like you said, I hope that the Russian Exarchate in Africa can make things right and perhaps push the Alexandrian Patriarchate back north of the Sahara, where they can perhaps reassess and come to Jesus a bit, and the Russians can handle the situation on the rest of the continent. But before I want to finish things up and talk about Dugan, Fuentes, and some stuff in Greece, Dimitri, I want to hear any final thoughts you have on the persecutions in Ukraine. We've seen Paschal services stormed by Ukrainian officials. We see schismatic supporters dragging old women, holding their pussy willow, stems out of church. We see these horrible things happening. So I'm wondering your thoughts on the current Ukrainian situation before I give some last stories and land this plane.
Yeah, I think, look, Christ has emerged out of Hades, and the gates have been opened. So naturally, the demons are incredibly upset on this holy week, on this holy day, and naturally, they'll be reacting in some places around the world, particularly Ukraine. But remember, all those persecuted during Bright Week, you're all confessors of Orthodox Christian faith. You're all essentially, on the first step towards sainthood, I would say. So I think this is, for any Christians being persecuted, this is actually a mark of a blessing, I would say, if anything. So yes, Ukrainians are being persecuted. Ukrainian Orthodox Christians are being completely harassed. There are churches being raided. I think more footage will come out this bright week as to what took place on this Easter Sunday in some of these western, central Ukrainian provinces. So this sort of concerning news, I think, shouldn't really scare us. In fact, this news should be more explanatory as to that we are on the right path here. And despite any of these persecutions, pressure from Satan and the forces of the Antichrist in Ukraine and globally speaking, nothing can really deter us from our faith in Christ. And yes, we will celebrate Easter in prisons if we need to. We'll celebrate it in catacombs. We'll celebrate it in caves. We really don't care. I mean, we've done it in the past. It really doesn't concern us Christians. We'll be persecuted until the end of time, and we're completely content with that. I think that's the main message. And I believe, we do pray for Metropolitan Arsenius sitting in a Dnipropetrovsk prison somewhere on the banks of the Dnieper River, and he's awaiting a potential sentence of 7 to 8 years for allegedly assisting the Russian forces by, mentioning that Ukrainians have set up block posts leading to his monastery, which are harassing Ukrainian Orthodox pilgrims. And apparently mentioning of those block posts on the roads and those sort of Ukrainian search posts is sort of providing scouting information to the Russian forces. And he just mentioned that in his sermon at the Svyatogorsk monastery, Lavra, the third largest monastery in Ukraine. So if that's giving information and spying for the Russians, then I think Ukrainians are just completely delusional. This is not a good faith particular stance. But, we mentioned the geography of the Russian expansion into Ukraine, and let's just pray that the Russians actually push forward with much haste and much needed pressure and sort of with holy vigor now that Patriarch Kirill has announced that, this is a sacred war for Orthodox Christianity, first and foremost, against persecutors of Christ, because the Svyatogorsk Lavra is located, 20 or 30 kilometers north of Kramatorsk-Slavyansk. So you remember we mentioned that north road and the sort of west road leading to Zaporozhye. So once that north road, north of Bakhmut towards Slavyansk Kramatorsk is taken, Svyatogorsk Monastery in the Svyatogorsk Mountains are just north of that. So in fact, the Russian Orthodox community of Svyatogorsk Lavra could be liberated from Ukrainian occupation in mere weeks if Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are taken. So as soon as you hear news about Russians sieging Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, you just have to think about the Christian message here. Russians need to save the Lavra from Ukrainian persecutors who are raiding it, who are searching its books, searching for anti-Semitic works, searching for books which are anti-Semitic in content, pro-Russian, pro-monarchy, essentially books which denounce the Ukrainian state. And once Russians take these two major twin cities, these two fortresses of Ukrainian resistance, the Lavra will be opened up, and actually the Ukrainians and Russians alike could actually, again, provide pilgrimage to the monastery, actually support it, and perhaps raise it up in prayer. So I think that's the development in Ukraine at the moment, how it's connected to the persecution. In terms of the other really short story was the statement of Metropolitan Kirill of Stavropol. So he's the head bishop of the military priests in Russia, so the military priests actually stationed in the armed forces. He stated that he has assessed the situation in the Russian army, and the Russian army requires 1,400 permanent priests to be stationed on the front lines and amidst the Russian forces. At the moment, there is maybe 300 to 400 priests only, and essentially they're on rotation. Andrei Afanasyev, who we're going to be interviewing very soon, a Russian Orthodox journalist, actually stated that, according to him, and this is in early 2024, there has been about 900 priests who have rotated in and out of the SMO zone so far. So if Bishop Kirill actually states that there needs to be 1,400. That's a lot of priests that the Russians require actually being stationed on the front line. So that's a big calling. Hopefully the Russian government can support that and move forward in terms of spiritually bolstering its armed forces, because that's essentially the only way in which this monetarily superior armed Antichrist force of the Ukrainian and globalist government can be defeated, I think, in this particular war, is through spiritual prowess and spiritual righteous power, I think.
I totally agree, and I think we're about to land the plane here. Going to mention the last few stories. We, of course, had the big interview between Tucker Carlson and Dugin. That occurred while Tucker was in Russia interviewing Putin. I guess they edited it and finally got it out to the public. They talk about liberalism. They talk about why Western countries have turned on their own people. They talk about the demonization of Russia and all these sorts of things. And Dugin gives a lot of good answers. I think we're going to talk about it and kind of the conversation that it sparked among the broader right wing with our good friend Momchilo Nevesky. So look forward to a discussion between me, Dmitry, and him in the near future. And the only other stories we really have is the issue in Greece. They are talking about banning the Spartans Party, which is a ethno-nationalist right-wing party. It's sort of the successor to the Golden Dawn, which was banned, and many of its members are in prison, very much persecuted by the pro-EU Greek center-right and center-left. But this party, the Supreme Court is about to decide whether or not they are going to be banned. It seems likely that they will not be able to participate in the election, despite the fact that they have 12 seats in parliament. They got almost 5% of the vote in a previous election. So it's a big slap in the face towards Greek nationalists. And if this occurs, we encourage everybody to support the Niki Victory Party, which is the Orthodox Christian Party. They themselves have 10 members of parliament and got almost 4% of the vote in the past. So if you're a Spartan supporter, support them. Some of these other parties, maybe we could get 8-9% of the vote for the Orthodox Party, which would be a big blessing for Greece, because we know that they are really struggling with the implementation of their Orthodox faith within a civil legal context. But the only other story we have besides that is a big white pill, and that is that Nicolas J. Fuentes has been restored to X, to Twitter. Elon Musk announced it recently that he will be consistent with his free speech principles and bringing Nick back. Very exciting. For those of you that don't know, I will be at AFPAC 4 in Detroit. I've got my tickets. I will be attending. I know some other Orthodox people, some World War Now fans are going to be there, so very exciting to see Nick. I met Nick in 2018 at American Renaissance, so I've been following him for a long time. It's really great to see him come back on the platform, to see X finally realize itself as a free speech platform. Now we just need Jared Taylor and David Duke back, and then it'll really be, the party that we all want it to be. So go follow at Nick J. Fuentes on Twitter. Comment World War Now stuff, post our clips and everything in his replies so that he can see the good work we're doing here and spread it around. So congrats, Nick. Glad to see you back. We'd love to talk to you on the show someday. But with all of that, it's been a great show. It's been a great week discussing World War III. Again, Christ is risen, everybody. Christos anesti, Christos voskresi, all of these things. I hope you are enjoying the celebration of the resurrection of Christ. So, Dimitri, I'll let you give the people your last thoughts.
Yes, I think the return of Nicolas J. Fuentes is a great development. It's coincidental that it occurs on Passion Week and Bright Week coming up. I mean, these are really bright news, I think, for all right-wing people, especially considering the recent anti-Semitic bill sort of going through Parliament. We'll probably discuss it more in depth next week when news from the Senate and President Biden actually take place. And because at the moment it's kind of still in the works, there's a lot of criticism going towards it. But news that Fuentes was back on social media is, I think, good for even us on World War Now, because in fact his message is about apparently just as radical, perhaps a little bit less radical than what we sort of speak about here, because we do speak from an Orthodox perspective, and he is a Roman Catholic, of course. So we do support his return. We support the fight for free speech. I think on social media is very, very important moving forward. So I'm glad Elon Musk facilitated all of this, and this is just really positive news. I think in general, I'm happy the way social media is going in recent years. It's just been great, and World War Now has really benefited from it. I think our community, you guys have really enjoyed the fact that you can obtain different news and various perspectives, and just wanted to say, enjoy your bright week, enjoy the Easter feast day. Looking forward. It's a great week. For those of you, celebrating your name's day this week, St. George's Day on the 6th of May tomorrow. Then we have, of course, the Victory Day on the 9th of May. So all those celebrating these great days. Bright week is full of festivities. So Christos Vaskresi, and I wish everybody a happy feast day, a great Easter. Thank you, Conrad, and Christ is risen.
Truly, he is risen. Yeah, you mentioned some of the anti-Semitism protests in the bill. I think we're going to have an Ether Hour where we kind of break down what's really going on with all of that. We saw the whole frat boy thing, and they all turned out to be Jews from the Jewish fraternity, quote unquote, protecting the American flag. Of course, the protests in America have heated up against Israel, and you mentioned that anti-Semitism law. Extremely crazy that went through the House, that was passed through the House on Holy Week, condemning so many of the things that our Holy Week hymns claim directly that the Jews did to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So for those of you that didn't know, yes, the Jews did kill Christ. That's kind of part of the whole story. So with all of that, thank you so much for listening, everybody. worldwarnow.co, that's worldwarnow.substack.com. Both links work. Get behind the paywall. You'll hear our upcoming discussion with Momchilo about Dugan, our upcoming discussions about all these anti-Semitism things going on, and we're having a big guest to talk about St. John Vitatsis III. So get behind the paywall. Huge things coming to the Ether Hours, and you support the show as well. So get behind the paywall, all of you that already support. Thank you so much. You're the ones that make all of this possible. But be sure to follow us on X, WorldWarNow_. Follow me at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're listening on Substack or YouTube right now, go to the other one and give it a like. Leave a comment. Share it. It really helps us out. Be sure to follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. Be sure to follow us on Rumble. That's the World War Now channel. And again, I'm on Twitter, GnomeRad. Dimitri's at OCanonist. Help us grow. Help us, get seen by people like Nick Fuentes and others. Comment our videos and clips in their replies and everything. And again, thank you so much for listening. Christ is risen. Enjoy your bright week.